So we're happy to have Peter Denton with us today. Peter was ordained in 1995 and has been retained on the roll of Winnipeg Presbytery since 2001. A minister's partner since 1988, he teaches ethics and sustainability along with technical communications at Red River College, and I know that's where he is at the moment. He is also Associate Professor of History at the Royal Military College of Canada, where he specializes in the history of technology, warfare, and society, as well as on the relationship between religion and war. He holds 5 degrees, including a PhD in religion and the social sciences, and is the author of many papers, articles, and reviews. I know that his 4th book, Gift Ecology: Reimagining a Sustainable World, was just released by Rocky Mountain Books. So welcome, Peter. We're glad to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks so much, Josephine, and welcome everyone to what I hope is going to be an interesting hour. The purpose of this webinar is to try to put in words and images what I've been thinking about and observing in the church for a number of years. Many of the things that I'm going to talk about are not going to be new or startling or exceedingly unfamiliar to you. But what I'm trying to do is to find a way of putting a problem and a potential avenue for solution in a framework that is understandable and able to be communicated effectively. So to some extent what we have here is a dry run at an idea, and I would really appreciate your feedback on what it is that I present today, whether that's during the presentation or to the email address that's at the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to start off, first of all, we'll see how all of these things work in terms of the technology. This is the outline of what we're going to talk about, and I've only picked 4 themes here just because of the time constraints. There are other ways we can look at some of the same problems and the application of the approach, but that will have to be left for another day. So to begin with the problem, overall there seem to be fewer and fewer people in our churches between the ages of 18 and 45. And where there has been success in what we call attraction and retention, it seems to be local and transient and apparently unable to be replicated elsewhere. We could talk about the accidental church, why we sometimes get it right by accident if we wanted to. But it seemed to me to be more constructive to look at a goal toward which we might be able to travel. We need to change the culture of church, not merely find better things to do. And the pitch that I'm going to make today is that the intentional church will be the result of changing who we are and not what we do. So why listen to me about this? Well, I'm going to try to explain that over the last 25 years, I've spent my life teaching that generation of people, the 18 to 45-year-olds. The key element in the courses that I've been teaching, which tend to be on important current themes, has been engagement, trying to get people to see themselves, to think differently about how they see the world, to make them consider the necessity of making meaningful social choices about important issues of our day, whether that's about the environment or health, about technology, about ethics. It's been a whole range of different spirituality, a whole range of different approaches, or different subjects, but the same common approach and same relative success in doing this. At the same time, I've seen the church from inside and out. As the partner of a person in ministry, I've also been in ministry myself, and I've worked with congregations in rethinking their structure and mission. So it's an experience that has been accompanied by studies in the background of this, along religion and social sciences, interdisciplinary stuff of all kinds. And so what I may be saying, I hope comes across as clear and simple and to the point, but it is something that is a product of a lot of thought and reflection as well. So what is the intentional church? What's the point here? Well, the intentional church does nothing by accident. Everything in its life and work is done by choice for reasons that are understood by all parties, whether or not they necessarily agree with the decisions that have been made. It does nothing out of routine. Its choices are made continuously, regardless of whether certain events or activities have been done before or not. So it's intentional about absolutely everything. At the same time, it is neither seduced by past successes nor discouraged by past failures. Every aspect of what it does receives the same thoughtful consideration before something happens, with an honest evaluation afterward. And whatever it chooses comes out of the people within its community. What they do comes out of who they are, not out of the expectations of others. So what I'm really saying here is that we need to engage in a conversation about that most explosive of topics, which is change in the church. And I find that it helps to use humor, especially if you're asking people to reconsider where they are, who they are, what they're doing, and perhaps to completely do a 180-degree turnaround in their activities. It's a hard thing to do, to accept that what you have been up to all this time for very good reasons and with the best of intentions is just entirely wrong. And to begin in that frame, or on that note, is to guarantee people's resistance and defensive behavior. So what I've found very useful is the use of humor, and in particular for today I've been able to illustrate the presentation with some cartoons that I created with Charlotte Jones a number of years ago, but which, despite the fact we need to upgrade the clerical garb of the person in there, I think still make the point that we want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the perils of change. First of all, the first peril is that there's none at all. That's the only kind of change I like to see in the church. So sometimes we just run into people who do not want to change anything. That's just the way they are, and we have to find a way of working around them. We try to go over them. We risk alienation. Then there's the problem of change to no good purpose. Due to concerns about the language in our next hymn, we will only sing the first line and the Amen. So change that is a compromise to all may not actually lead to anything that is worth attending for the entire congregation. Then there's a change that causes conflict. And using the example here of 47 charges of assault with a new hymn book. That's self-explanatory. If change causes conflict, it had better be changed for a very good reason, because there will always be people who are hurt by that kind of conflict. Then there's change that completely misses the point. So we decided to replace the children's story with a senior's moment. That's one way of dealing with the problem that you don't have children in church for the children's time. So what I'm saying is that we need intentional self-assessment all the time and in all things, even to what the coffee's like. If you like the cartoons, feel free to throw up an applause or something. Sometimes change is slow. Actually, me and the wife is inclusive language for Harvey. Sometimes desperation takes over. Our Sunday school numbers picked up when we converted the basement to laser tag. This week's lesson is Armageddon. Sometimes coercion wins out. That's a best before date. That way you have to come back. And sometimes we miss what is right in front of our eyes. I'm not early. I've been here since last week. Finally, sometimes in the church when we know there needs to be change, we just have to close our eyes and let things happen. And now Miss Pringle will favor us with her liturgical dance on the theme of old wine in new wineskins. So the purpose here of that little illustration of the nature of change in the church is that I'm sure there are some of those cartoons that struck home. And if we can present the problems that are around us in the church with a view to some humor, we have a much better chance of enabling people to see who they are and what they're doing in a way that allows them to come to their own conclusions about what they need to do differently. When it comes to the group that we're talking about, those 18 to 45-year-olds, the problem that I've found is that the church is not presenting them with the kind of place and the kind of opportunities that I have found in the classroom they are most desiring. I don't think it's an issue that we have a group of people who have no interest in the church. It's that what they find, quite literally, is not something to which they feel they belong, or to which they feel they can contribute, within which they feel they belong, and which satisfies some of the deeper questions that they and their generation have. And to be fair, these are questions that in other generations the church has found ways of being able to address. So the four themes that we have here, and I've asked that you put your questions to the end just so that I can make a pitch and give you an idea of how intentionality shapes the difference in what it is the church could do, is to give you the whole pitch and some sense of what this might mean. And I'm going to pause periodically to take a drink here because I'm fighting a bug at the moment. And it is only water. So the first issue is that the timing of the service. And the reality that I think confronts younger generations today is that you have 1 hour. Somehow churches get into the idea, or congregations get into the idea, that there is an opportunity for more time if there were more commitment, if there was something more interesting happening, or if there was more diversion provided, or perhaps PowerPoint thrown up on a screen. The reality is you have 1 hour, and here's what some congregations do to make sure the minister keeps on time. You fill the sanctuary with clocks, and I've actually been in some congregations where the only clock in the sanctuary was a very large one at the back that the only people could see were the choir and the preacher. So you have an hour, and that hour needs to be used in ways that are fruitful and intentional and that work every time. If that is not the case, if people are making the effort to get there for that hour worship and they do not experience what they think they need to experience, then there's much less incentive to be there on a regular basis, and their attendance becomes as hit and miss or as accidental as the service itself. So we find in the community that people have a certain view of what it is we do, that there is a level of perception in the community that is very hard to beat. It's kind of like the way in which word of mouth sells products. If you get a bad reputation in the community, you can put out all the advertising that you like, and people still will not show up at your door to buy your product. So the 1 hour needs to be used in an intentional fashion. Timing is everything. And I think in response to this whole idea that we can perhaps move services around the week to accommodate people's schedules simply isn't a fruitful approach. We need to use every minute of our worship time together deliberately and well. There's no point in flexibility and multiple entry opportunities, and if you want to come at Wednesday at 4 or Thursday at 9:30 or Sunday morning at 11 or whatever. Church for shift workers idea really doesn't work in terms of the population at large. People schedule their lives around a multitude of things. To have that one fixed point on a Sunday morning, I think, is still the most important time If they want to be there, there will be a way found in the schedules to make that happen. And part of the problem with these flexible opportunities and trying to splinter the congregation into different worship times during the week is that it fundamentally undermines the sense of community. And if you take this path and develop seeker services or whatever they happen to be called, you run the risk of alienating the members of the congregation itself. So if I stop seeking, says this old fellow, I have to come here Friday night instead. So if along the lines of the intentionality of the time that is being used, one of the problems and one of the entry points that is often used for the church is join a committee, go to meetings. And while I realize that there needs to be some way of getting jobs accomplished within the church, one of the things that we have to fundamentally rethink is how we run the structures of the church. My argument would be that committees are structures designed for the dissipation of energy, spiritual as well as physical. And what's more, if we talk about using our time deliberately and well, it probably does not mean meetings, period. When we emphasize process over project, we waste time for no discernible positive outcome. If the process is to build community, then let's have an event that builds community. Let's not pretend that building community happens during the context of a meeting. This tends to be the perception of meetings, isn't it? Annual congregational meetings in hell, when the motion to adjourn is out of order. Don't you just love committee work? People do not have a good perception of the types of things that happen in committees, or how fruitful or how fulfilling or how energizing committee work happens to be. We tend to have a disposable battery model of church leadership where we take a volunteer, we stick him into a position, we suck it dry, and then remove the battery and plug in a new one, and on the system goes. So part of our fundamental rethinking of the church, I think, has to be how we view the work that it does. The second theme that I want to throw out to you is the perils of being grandma's church. Now, I think the obvious point here is the perils of being grandma's church is that if it's grandma's church, it isn't yours. So that's the first point. That's the obvious point. But we need to dig deeper into the implications of what being grandma's church means. The obvious ones and the not so obvious ones. So let's take a look at this. The first peril of being grandma's church is obviously the one of tradition, that this is the way things have been done. You might argue that tradition in the church is anything you do twice. So we have a multitude of traditions. These are not things that have to go back into distant memory. They only have to have been done twice. Measure that against your own experience in the church, and think about the kinds of ways in which you do things that become rooted in the life of a congregation. And the more rooted they become, the harder they are to root out. Of course, some of us are more bound by tradition than others, and some people will feel the dead hand of history on them more strongly than others. But it's still a peril that if tradition is something that becomes preeminent in the way in which the church operates, then you are losing your intentionality in terms of relating to the people who are actually there. The second peril of being grandma's church is the one of routine. And this isn't so much tradition as it is the expectation of how things are always done. I'll believe in miracles the first time Miss Pringle sits somewhere else. And you can think back in your own experience the number of small things in the routine of the life of a congregation which are alienating, are hostile, perhaps overtly hostile to newcomers, regardless of the types of events that you try to hold, or the sorts of things that you put together to welcome newcomers and to make them feel at home, and all the rest of the rhetoric that goes with it. they walk into the sanctuary and sit in the wrong pew and heaven help them, they won't come back. The third peril is that in response to it being Grandma's church is the rebel that walks in and says we need change for the sake of it. And so we flip the music upside down. And now the little ditty chorus will lead us in yet another refrain. Changing the music of the heart of a congregation's life goes to the heart of tradition and routine. And if it's not done in a way that people understand the need for those changes, you risk the kind of change that causes conflict to no good end. The fourth peril is the peril of letting Grandma do the work. After all, it is her church, isn't it? So it's Grandma's church, let Grandma do the work. And if you think of the number of congregations that assume that the younger generation is going to step up and do the work that needs to be done to keep the church as they understand it in motion and motion forward, and keeping the roof shingled and the basement cleaned and all the rest of that, the dilemma is that if the sense of ownership is not there, then the people who are in that younger generation do not feel the need to step up and do the work. It's Grandma's church. It's like going home to Grandma's. Grandma does the cooking. Everybody reverts to their role as children, and regardless of their age. And Grandma continues to host them in the events that are held there. So when it's Grandma's church, it's like going home to Grandma's house, and the result is people do not either step up to do the work or feel that it's the kind of work that needs to be done or that they want to do. And if Grandma is really still able enough to maintain her role as matriarch and gatekeeper, even if the people did want to step up and do some things, they may find themselves, on the one hand, leading very productive lives as people responsible for the lives of others outside the church, but the moment they hit the door of the church, if they come for 6 or 8 months, we might elevate them to the position of being able to take up the collection. And it's a generational issue. So as you can see, it worries me, turning the congregation over to that younger generation. What constitutes youth in the church, what constitutes the younger generation, I've noticed with some amusement, keeps going up and up. I found myself as the youngest person in the room, or one of the younger people in the room in terms of ministry, for the last 20 years. And I haven't got any younger in the last 20 years, just the average age seems to be going up and up. So we are not attracting the people that we need to attract. So if we get them to the church, and if we get them to understand the importance of intentionality, if we get them to think about the sense of ownership that's required to be part of the congregation, what is it that we do in that hour of worship that makes enough of a difference in the lives of the younger generations to make them want to come back, to find the time, to make the effort, to do the things that are required in their other lives to come back to church? And this is, I think, one of the main failings of not only the United Church in Canada today, but other denominations as well, is that somehow we have really dropped the ball in terms of the message. I mean, I'm coming at this from a Reformed perspective, where the word is important, the preached word is important, and I recognize that there are other traditions that hold to different value set, but it seems to me that there's a reason why we devote, or should devote, the most time in that hour to the sermon. And it's because we need to have some opportunity for someone to offer comment, to make sense of their life experience or their faith experience or the scriptures in a way that relates to who we are. Now, this isn't new. But the problem is that with our shift toward, I think, electionary-based preaching, and our shift toward what passes for liturgy in the church, we have moved away from the hermeneutic of understanding and interpreting the text or life or whatever, to the exegetical, which instead of telling you what I think the passage means, I'm going to tell you what it says, and what the commentators have offered, and what various lectionary groups that I've been in have offered as wisdom as to what this could mean. It distances me from the text, it distances the congregation from what it is that I say, and it reduces the level of instruction to something that is far inferior to something that if I really wanted to know that information, I could look up online in 15 minutes myself. So I'm calling it the exegetical thud. We exegete the text instead of being providing an apologetic for what it means or an interpretation of what it means. And I would argue that this XYZ generation is in search of meaning, not instruction. They're perfectly able to get more information off their search engines in 5 minutes than I can in an hour. And the older generations, like me, need to be aware that it is not information that is the problem today. It is what that information means, and in a sea of information, what information is the most meaningful and why. But instead of meaning, we give liturgy, which I will take the strong stance here as the professional excuse for doing the same thing over and over again. We offer sermon series. So here we have the fruits of the Spirit. Tonight is rutabagas, and next week is crab apples. And we find ourselves surprised when a sermon titled "Who on Earth Cares" leads to no one in the pews. I would argue that this generation needs information because many of them did not grow up in the church, but they don't need instruction. So you've never been to church, but you want your child done. Would that be well, medium, or rare? He's only come to spaghetti dinners before. He wants to know if this is all you can eat. So there is a real need for information out in the general population about what it is the Christian faith is, and we have to be very careful about how that information is provided. Because if it's provided in the level of basic instruction, you have no way of knowing the rate at which people want to have that information. You're anticipating the questions they might have. You are guessing at what might be the way to move forward, and you may get it right, but you get it right by accident, and you won't get it right twice. Christian bookstores, Christian television shows, Christian music, Christian toys. Is Christianity really a religion or just a marketing cluster? So we need worship that is self-aware. We have to really see what it is we're saying and doing. Now it's time for the children to go downstairs. We need to rethink what it is we are experiencing in terms of the lives of the people that are in our congregation. We need a willingness to rethink the story. I know we just agreed to give him the gold, but this place really smells. What happens when St. Peter forgets his password? Of course, God is a perfectionist. After Eve, there was no need to try a third time. We need worship that takes chances. We need worship that encounters culture, but does not chase it. How often have you seen this kind of motion come to a committee? All those in favor of sacramental milk and cookies for communion on Children's Sunday. Or the fads. We want to get married on the water slide. And then we were supposed to get married on the water slide, but on the way down she met someone else. But we also need worship, and the church knows when to draw the line. Yes, there are many names for God, but bucko isn't one of them. So in terms of the intentionality of our worship, we need to also find ways of encouraging the sort of stewardship of time and of money that the church requires. And this is one theme here. Watching the time, I'm going to have to pick up the pace because I want to leave lots of time for comments and questions. But the theme of nothing's too cheap for Jesus. Here's our donate to our rummage sale. Nothing's too cheap for Jesus. Somehow we have managed to find a way of convincing people that money in the church is viewed exactly in the opposite to the level of sacrifice that is at the heart of the Christian message. So we get lots of people for congregational events, but for some reason no one comes to worship. It becomes the Saint Spaghetti and Junk Church to the community. Mother's Day rummage sale, buy her something special. So we raise money in ways that undermine the nature of the gift we have received and the sacrifice that is at the heart of the Christian faith, period, all the time. I would argue it would be more honest and more effective to charge for admission. I think what you will find in terms of stewardship studies and surveys and the attitudes of the people that I know is that they will give to a project, they will give for a purpose, they will give for a reason, all of which are intentional. They will not just simply give into space. And they will certainly not give to situations or opportunities like this. So we need to be intentional about our stewardship. Being cheap is not a Christian virtue. Churches have the least vision for anything requiring money. And it seems that the place where corners can always be cut is with staff whose leadership role in defining the community is consistently undermined by financial restrictions as well as psychological ones. And while we make jokes about these kinds of situations, and you may well have witnessed them yourself, to someone from the outside or someone in that XYZ generation, these things cease to be funny. So, what are the next steps? Well, we need a new vision. But even when we talk about visions, we don't necessarily see the level of intentionality about what it is we're trying to accomplish. So I'm a little concerned about our visioning committee. Sometimes our vision statements, in effect, end up being the last one to leave, turn out the lights. And yet, with the right approach, with the right, I think, amount of humor and self-evaluation, we can find opportunities to do new things. And we need to remember that the God we serve has a sense of humor. And perhaps that's one of the reasons we are placed in groups and given the opportunity to do these things to begin with. So this is where I would like to invite you to offer comment or question, and I'd be really interested in some debate back and forth on the concept of intentionality. If we look at everything we do and tear it down into pieces and figure out why exactly are we doing this, and have the opportunity for some consensus about why something is being done. My argument would be is that we can affect the sorts of changes in the church that not only allow or bring in people who are not currently part of the mix, but to reshape fundamentally the way in which the church functions. So we have one question that's come up here. There has been some discussion around the audience of our worship. For whom do we design worship? For those who are already there or those who are not with us? And how do we balance these two objectives? And I think the answer to that one, I think that we have to design it for both. If we only design it for the people who are there, then obviously the people who come in from outside, who fit with what is already there, will continue to stay. But even at that, they are fitting in as opposed to finding ways at which their own interests can be brought into the mix. I think we have to if we design the life of our churches around what's already there, they will continue as they are. And in fact, that's the reason I would say that things have continued pretty much the way they've always been. But if we want to design the church for those who are not there, then we have to do so in a way that the people who are present at the moment will understand the nature of those changes and not just simply fight back against them. Now, I'm not sure, are people going to put up hands to offer verbal comments, or are we just going to work off the side of the screen? If I could get asked.
I'm just going to try my audio here. I don't know if my microphone is working. Can people hear me? Okay, good. Excellent. Sometimes when I switch off my webcam and switch it back on, then I lose my sound, so I'm happy about that. Peter, I've invited people to type in questions and comments into the chat pod as they think of them, and I've offered my own questions to the group to spark our thinking, and I know that we're all reflecting on what these issues mean for our own contexts and congregations. So as people are typing, I have a question here from myself about change, and I'm just wondering, in your own experience of either through your spouse's congregational involvement or your own, or from congregations that you know that are going through change and transition, when has this been handled well? Can you make a comment on some of the intentional marks that that cause a good outcome?
Sure. I had one very amusing experience. It was 20 years ago. It was a rural congregation, 150 years old, Presbyterian, and they felt the need. It was a dwindling congregation that had some serious problems that had been long-standing for a very long time. It was the second point in a charge that had always been a second point. And they asked me to help them redesign their whole congregation. And I thought, this is just a recipe for disaster unless I can find a way around the inevitable gatekeeping that was there. And so I got four people who were representative of the whole congregation. So they were trusted. They were not part of the structures directly, but they were trusted people. And we called them a team as opposed to a committee, and I think that's an important word. And invited every group in the church to come and give us their answers to two questions. One was, what is your role in the church or in the congregation, and how do you fulfill it? Just those two simple questions. And it was just stunning that by the end of the probably 4 or 5 hours of interviews that we did with all of the different groups in the congregation, that those four people came to an absolute realization of how they needed to rethink the structures of the church. And they put out in words what it was I would have given them to begin with, and came up with an answer to the life and nature of worship and the intentionality of that congregation that 20 years later is still functioning and allowing the church to transition through all sorts of changes that 20 years ago would have been completely unthinkable. That's one example. Another example that I thought was very funny was that in one congregation where we had this problem of shifting from committees to teams, and so I made the word committee a bad word, and we brought out a pink plastic pig, and anyone who used the word committee anywhere in the confines of the church was fined a nickel. Cost me a couple of bucks right off the bat. But by the end of a month, we had literally changed the vocabulary and the way in which people use that word in the church, and raised about 60 bucks for mission and service. So that intentionality, forcing people to think about their language, made a huge difference. So I've got some questions here that I need to see if I can read. So from Anna, Christine, does Christine have her hand up? See a green check mark there. Anyway, Anna Taylor.
Christine is agreeing with something that you said, I think.
How much of this is a problem about not
sure
being intentional about developing community that is inclusive? Too often churches are looking for 18 to 45-year-old versions of themselves. Absolutely. We have to find ways of allowing the voice of these people to be heard. For example, I've had this experience in congregations where I wanted to do something for that age group that was still present, and knowing that if I put on an event in the church and if I didn't sort of put some sort of exclusion on there, that the seniors would all be just thrilled to do it, and they would flood the place, and we would be still stuck with an 80-20 split between the people who I really wanted to talk to and the ones who were just delighted to have this kind of opportunity in the church. We have to be inclusive, but we have to allow this age group to express the concerns that are on their mind, and I don't see it happening. I'm just sort of reading other questions here on the side. Creating joy in worship from Darren. Absolutely. Worship should be something that people miss. And there's nothing worse. I mean, as a teacher, when students say to me, did I miss anything in our last 3-hour class? You have to be able to say, yes, you did. And no, you can't make it up. Because when people find out that they have missed something, there's therefore a need for them to show up the next time. And in preaching, it's the same way. You say things once, if people aren't paying attention or they snooze, then they've missed it. And I found that really does change the kind of reception that you have to the preaching that is done. There's a question here about a change in governance structure from small groups wanting to do. How do you get? Essentially, it's a question about gatekeepers. How do you stop the gatekeepers? Well, one of the ways, I think the only way you can do that is to literally throw everything out on the table for discussion. Everything, including your own role and what goes on in the church. And when you do that, the gatekeepers are reduced to either some extreme measure, locking the doors of the church or whatever else, and you can deal with that in other fashions, to put their own interests on the table as well. And often I have found that the gatekeepers are gatekeeping with the best of intentions, not realizing absolutely how destructive their results might happen to be. And I think that that kind of opportunity allows you to work around rather than having to run over the people who are actually very important in the life of the church. Josephine's got a question here. How do we offer opportunities for engagement of young people in volunteer and leadership positions rather than organizing programs for 18 to 45-year-olds? I think it has to be something where they actually feel that their voice is being heard. I work on ethics and sustainability, and I think that if I were to say to make the hard case that the church's absolute failure to grapple with the moral implications of climate change is the single greatest failure of the Christian church in any age. Young people are growing up in a world where they may not have a future. In fact, the signs are increasingly that the future is even shorter than the climate scientists have said. And they go to church, and all they get is an exegetical lesson on what this passage really meant back when it was first written. And so they are not connecting with the issues. The church is not connecting with the issues that are crucial ones in the lives of young people, particularly today. And it's not that they're looking for answers. They're looking for someone to try and grapple with what's going on. So if the minister or the preacher or whoever happens to be delivering the message that day takes a swing at it and really tries, it doesn't matter if people agree or not. They at least know that someone is wrestling with those questions just as they are. And if even if they violently disagree with what's being said, it allows the opportunity for a conversation, as opposed to pretending that there's really nothing going on. We've got another question showing up here. Different models of preaching. I think that the main issue here is engagement, is that the preacher has to engage the audience, and how that works will depend on the style, on the nature of the group, on what it is that you want to say. But there should be no way that someone can doze off in the back pew. The sermon is not an opportunity for some quiet reflection or sleep. The sermon should be an opportunity to be engaged with whatever the message of the day happens to be. And it's like I teach large classes, and people who try to doze off know that they're going to be right front and center in terms of an illustration the moment that I catch a glimpse of what it is they're up to. So it has to be that sense of engagement. Churches, and we unfortunately call it a sanctuary. The church should not be a refuge or a sanctuary. There are opportunities for that, and Sunday morning worship is not an opportunity for refuge, not with all of the things that are going on that we so desperately need to address. And I see another question coming up here. Zoe,
Hi, Peter. I can't type as fast as I can. Yeah. I hope people can hear me. If you can't hear me, I invite you to type into the chat pod there. I do invite your questions as participants. We've had a few come up here, and I've been adding some of my own, but we do have a few minutes to go, so we welcome your engagement around the concept of intentionality. I think, Peter, what I was starting to type there was a question about your experience of sort of discipleship formation, small groups, opportunities to talk about issues like climate change and sustainability. Do we have young people? What is your experience around the involvement of young people in those conversations? Are congregations providing opportunities that are giving that opportunity for people to explore those issues?
At the risk of sounding like more of a heretic, I'm not convinced that small group ministry is really the way to go. One of the problems with it is that the small group is an attempt structurally to deal with the issue of engagement. And there may well be the need to have a small group that engages in particular projects or actions. But if you are trying to build community in the church as a whole, then you need to find ways of bringing people together, not separating them off into pods. There's always going to be in every church a pod of people who are interested in mission and outreach. They may be 85 years old. It doesn't mean that they would not welcome an 18-year-old, but the 18-year-old isn't necessarily going to feel that their interests or their ideas are going to be heard, and they probably would resent being the one that always gets asked to do all the legwork. So that I would see the small group response as a structural response instead of getting behind what the small group is intended to do, and that's to engage people in some sort of community building. My experience is that more something that's more project focused, to do a task. I remember in one congregation I wanted to bring in refugee sponsorship, and the Mission and Outreach Committee was comprised of very old people, many of whom were disabled and couldn't do the work, but they thought this was an important thing for the congregation, and so I said I would take it to the board and try to identify some people who would have a team that was responsible for bringing in sponsoring a refugee family. And when I showed my partner in ministry in this congregation, I was new and I was in an interim position, the list of people that I was going to approach, he kind of laughed and said they were all in this age bracket, 30 to 45. He said, you've found some really good people, but they're all absolutely burnt out. There are presbytery reps, they don't want to be part of this anymore. He said, knock yourself out. You got 2 hours to the board meeting, see what you can do. So I phoned those people, and of the ones that I called, only one had to decline because he'd just taken on a major volunteer role in the community. And what I said to them was, here's a job, we want to bring in a refugee family, You people meet whenever you need to, as you need to, or not at all, but just get the job done. Are you interested in doing something practical? They all leapt at it, and it was a huge success that brought in people from the community over the next couple of years, long after I was gone. They even got written up in the national news about it. And the key was making it a specific project that people could work on in their own way without imposing structures from outside. So that's the kind of way in which I think small groups would work most effectively. And Carolyn's question here about, or comment about the need to encourage intentionality in the life of parishioners, absolutely. In my courses on sustainability, they begin with the fact that we all make hundreds of ethical choices every day, and we don't think about them. So that's why we live in a world that's such a mess, is because perfectly intelligent people make choices without thinking about them, or without thinking enough. And were we to think enough about them, we simply wouldn't be doing the things that we do. So being intentional in terms of how we live our lives and the choices that we make as individual Christians spins off into the larger community. So it reinforces that whole theme of the church. Now, Darren's comment about smaller churches, he talks about the fact that if you have people coming to a smaller church because they like the sense of community, that's because they can engage with each other. They're not sitting in some barn. And so that level of engagement, again, is what's, I think, at the heart of that desire. We want to be with people. I mean, if we want to just be in our own little pod, we can stay at home. We do that all week with our iPhones or iPods plugged into our head. So I think that smaller setting is a critical one. Carolyn asks, need ways to find and draw on our traditions. Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of intentionality is not to get rid of tradition. It's to say that everything we do is the result of what we want to see happen. Why are we doing this? We have an answer for that. It's not because we've always done it that way, or the third Sunday of the month it's always this. It is something where, why do we have this particular event? Why do we do this at this time? And if we all understand why that has to change or why that has to continue, then you see the younger people appreciating the value of tradition, and you see the older people appreciating why it is things need to change. But in the absence of the conversation, it all depends on who's in power and who swings the bigger stick. And inevitably there are going to be casualties in that. I think that I don't think that young people are opposed. Coming up with another question here, young people aren't opposed to tradition. There's something very comforting in some respects about being part of a tradition that is some stability in a world where there seems to be less and less stability. But it has to be a thinking kind of tradition. The tradition that is the most important one is, and the one that should continue from generation to generation, because this is how practical knowledge continues, is that it's useful. If a tradition is not useful, if it's not found to be of value to the next generation, then there's no reason it should continue. If we can make the case that there's a reason for this, there's a value to it, I think young people are accepting of that. Starting from new, what does that mean? I think that's one of the fads that comes out of our culture that says the new has got to be better than the old, that there's something called progress. And in fact, the more we unpack those sorts of things, the less we find it to be the case. Let's see any other. Josephine says,
Carolyn is agreeing that young people aren't opposed to tradition. Yes, a thinking kind of tradition. It's been certainly my experience as well, and some of the congregations I've been a part of, that there are several people that are there because they do see that as part of their heritage, their family, their tradition, and so church very much has been that sanctuary, that place of comfort for them. So we need to recognize, and as you say with intention, that people come from different walks of life and they're looking for different things, and some appreciate tradition, and it's always that kind of marriage of tradition and doing innovative ministry. Carolyn also writes, for example, contemplative practices. Absolutely. Peter, I just want to echo my own appreciation for this topic of intention, um, and realizing that it's not so much the things we do, but why we do them and how we do them. And there are innumerable ideas for developing, designing relevant worship, for doing creative ministry and different forms of small groups, and we had discussion on that. And there are lots of different ideas about things that we can do, but it's not, I think your point is not so much the what, but how we do it and why we do it, and to think carefully about that and to engage in the thinking and create opportunities for younger people to feel that their perspectives are valued in the leadership and ministry of our church. And that it's about a question of culture change and creating an environment where people are free to be themselves and to offer themselves in
One other thing
ministry
that
and
I
to be
wanted to
part
say
of that
before we
thinking
conclude
and reflection
is
in an
I'm
intentional
really
way.
opposed to the idea of one size fits all. It's one of those mythologies of mass culture that somehow there is one magic answer. And it really has to be the answer that fits your circumstance in your area and the people that are there. And if your ministry is to people, if there are no young people in the community, it doesn't make much sense to beat yourself up on where they might be. If your ministry involves certain necessities in terms of the location in which you live, don't beat yourself up that you're not somewhere else or someone else. I think that that's where the real integrity in the life of a congregation comes from. I think that's where you can be intentional about what's important and what's not important, and you can also therefore make the kinds of changes that need to be made to maintain a healthy community. And before we're out of time here, I want to make sure that I'd like some feedback from you on what you think of the cartoons, if you think that kind of approach works, if those things would take the edge off some discussions on these issues in your congregations. My email address is up there at the end, and I'd appreciate hearing from you. So.
Thank you, Peter. And I also encourage anyone who was with us today to email Peter with your comments and feedback. And also, I invite you to fill out the feedback form that Edge provides, and you can follow the link that's listed at the bottom right of your screen, or wait for the email that will come out in a little while. So thank you, Peter, for taking the time to be with us today. I think you have to rush off to class now. So we'll let you do that, and we appreciate your approach, and I certainly appreciated the comics myself. It's a different way to do it, and humor is so much needed in this time when we have all these challenging conversations around change and the nature of
Thank you
ministry
very
and
much.
mission in the future.